Hey guys, welcome back to Oz and Elsewhere. I'm Rebecca, welcome to my channel. And this time I wanted to introduce not just this video, but a new series that I wanted to do called Does It Hold Up? Where I'm going to look at books from my childhood or children's books in general and analyze them in depth. Some would say overanalyzing. I say treating them with the seriousness that they deserve, because literature for young people is also very important. And at the end, ultimately asking the question, does it hold up now when I read it as an adult? So the first video in this series, I wanted to make it about Percy Jackson, because that was one of my favorite series growing up. And the TV show came out and reminded me of this fandom that I was in, arguably the first fandom I was ever in. So that's why today we'll be talking about Percy Jackson and the rot at the core of Western civilization. So this is the first book that I want to talk about in this Does It Hold Up series, and it's Percy Jackson. It's the first book in Percy Jackson and the Olympians. It's called The Lightning Thief. So if you were living under a rock in the mid-2000s, or unlike me, you were not in elementary school then, you maybe don't know about Percy Jackson. So here's a quick introduction to the series. So basically, Percy Jackson and the Olympians follows a troubled preteen in New York who finds out that his long absent father is actually the Greek god Poseidon. And he's part of this whole world of children of Greek gods and mortals called demigods or half-bloods. Oh, and he wasn't really supposed to be born because there's this prophecy around his birth, and now he's expected to solve a whole bunch of problems that the gods have and save them from this massive existential threat. So the first series was 5 books, and then it spanned several spin-off series featuring Percy and some new characters, other series by Riordan with characters based on Norse and Egyptian mythology, an entire imprint called Rick Riordan Presents, dedicated to mythology from different cultures and kind of promoting authors of color, a musical, 2 widely panned movies, and most recently a TV series that the jury's still kind of on about, at least in my opinion, but was much welcomed by fans. So the central premise of the books is that the Greek gods are now based in the United States. And this was actually fairly common for Greek myth retellings. I remember reading a few of these as a kid. But usually they just kind of plop the Greek gods in the world and don't really do much explaining besides like, yeah, they're in the US now. But Percy Jackson actually has in-world lore on why Mount Olympus is now on top of the Empire State Building. Oh, yeah, and anyway, there'll be spoilers in this video for the entire plot of The Lightning Thief, so if you don't want spoilers for a book that is nearly 20 years old now, this may not be the video for you. So anyway, so the beginning of the book, Percy finds out that he's a half-blood. He gets taken to this place called Camp Half-Blood, and one of the leaders is Chiron, and Chiron is explaining to Percy what's going on. So Percy goes, well, the Greek gods, and then they died. And Chiron says, died? No. Did the West die? The gods simply moved to Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flame was brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. All you need to do is look at the architecture. People do not forget the gods. Every place they've ruled for the last 3,000 years, you can see them in paintings and statues on the most important buildings. Like it or not, and believe me, plenty of people weren't very fond of Rome either, America is now the heart of the flame. It is the great power of the West. And so Olympus is here, and we are here. So Riordan takes a very literal interpretation of this, where the Greek gods themselves physically move with Western civilization. However, the idea of ancient Greece as being the core of Western civilization really is nothing new. Even though the ancient Greeks wouldn't have considered themselves to be part of any unified Greek culture. As soon as the Romans, you see the powers that be kind of emulating and taking from ancient Greece. I mean, the Romans pretty much, this is a very simplistic way of putting it, they copied a lot of Greek stuff. And this Greek influence continues until, through the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance. But we really see the growth of Philhellenism and Hellenomania into the 18th and 19th centuries, where a couple of things start happening. First, it becomes more common for wealthy, young, especially British men to go on this grand tour of Europe once they come of age, which includes visiting the ancient Greek ruins. There's also the Enlightenment, which seeks to find a kind of scientific rationale and create a society defined by those ideas. And Enlightenment philosophers were looking for kind of ideas rooted in rationality that they saw as opposed to kind of Christian superstition, but especially Eastern superstition. Even more importantly than that is the Industrial Revolution and imperialism, because this is when this reverence for ancient Greece takes on some more sinister tones. So Katherine, Harloe, and Nicoletta Momigliano are the editors of a volume on Hellenomania, and they write in their introductory chapter, "The idealization of ancient Greece in the cultural and educational ideology of many powerful and imperialistically active nations has, moreover, exported elements of Hellenomania across the globe." So when discussing Hellenomania, it's not just about who is being idolized, but who is being the idolizing. So Hellenomania becomes not just about the democracy, the philosophy, the architecture of ancient Greece. It becomes about proving something, because the people doing this idolizing are members of the wealthiest, the most powerful societies that are at that moment engaging in never before seen wars of imperialism and expansion. So the authors cite Martin Bernal's Black Athena, who they say originated this kind of idea of Hellenomania in a negative context. And Bernal, in his work, wrote how Hellenomania was used to justify the dominion of Protestant Europeans over the rest of the world, which is kind of ironic considering Greek people are Christian Orthodox, not Protestants, by tracing the roots of their culture to ancient Greece, which they then valorize. So that's those are all the disparate lines going into this idea of ancient Greece as the core of Western civilization. Now, obviously there's since been a lot of critique of this idea of Hellenomania, and what I find interesting is that a lot of these critiques come from Greek people themselves. So a lot of modern Greek scholars have a very critical view of the 18th and 19th century Hellenomania or Philhellenism, even though at the time European elites justified it with, their support for the struggle for Greek independence against the Ottomans. But now Greek scholars are saying this was a very quasi-colonial framework imposed on Greek people that to this day ignores the 2,000 and something years since ancient Greece and the very many cultural influences that contributed to the rest of Greece's history, as well as the modern problems and the very real people living in Greece today. And this critique also gets echoed by some modern Greek writers of speculative fiction who have pointed out that, a lot of the writers that have made the most money and gotten the most prominence writing about Greek myths are Westerners, Americans or Brits, while Greek writers are not really paid to tell those stories. And I wish I'm having such a brain spark where I can't remember who I've seen this before, but I'll make sure to link that in the video notes because I've seen a very interesting set of critiques on this. So I mean, even though it's like I discussed the idea of Hellenomania as a thing of the past, it very much isn't, because the idea of Greek civilization being passed on and it being the core of the West is still here. I mean, I can just tell you from my high school and elementary school curriculum, that was the tone taken. And usually the tone is very laudatory. It's very, the ancient Greeks were great, and we got everything good about Western civilization from them. And it's interesting, it's not just school that does this. It's used to kind of pass on this idea. It's also children's literature. So Sheila Murnaghan wrote this article called Classics for Cool Kids, Popular and Unpopular Versions of Antiquity for Children, which examines the history of Greek myth retellings for kids from Nathaniel Hawthorne to Rick Riordan, and how basically these retellings are used to instill in children kind of love for classical values. Now, the author analyzes the difference in tone between Rick Riordan and some of these older retellings, like D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. It says, Riordan has a much more irreverent tone. And she kind of looks down on this. She says, it's because he's trying to reach children that he just assumes kids automatically don't like school, and implies that it's like a how you doing fellow kids kind of moment. But I actually think that's being a bit cruel to Riordan. I mean, he's been very open about the fact that his target audience were kids that were pushed out of traditional schooling because of their learning disabilities, such as his own child. So obviously, he's trying to reach kids that aren't served by traditional schooling. But also, I think part of that irreverent tone is the fact that we're now able to take a more critical look at ancient Greece and a more critical look at the myths, and not look at them as just, oh, this is the foundation of Western civilization, but not. Some of these stories, they're a bit messy. If ancient Greece is at the core of our civilization, and in Riordan's interpretation, that means literally ancient Greek gods are the core of our civilization, then what are the gods like? And what does that say about us? In Percy Jackson, the gods are So the very first god we meet is Dionysus, who's sentenced to be the head of Camp Half-Blood for punishment, and he is literally described as being whiny and petulant like a child. And all the rest of the gods are pretty much described as vain, petulant, and not super duper intelligent. So we don't meet Zeus until the end of the book. But at the very beginning, we get an insight into his personality because he is convinced that Percy has stolen his lightning bolt. So he collectively punishes all of Camp Half-Blood with bad weather because he suspects one kid, showing just how petulant he is. And at the end, when Percy returns the lightning bolt to him, his reward is, oh, I'll let you live. Grateful much. And then the third god we meet, who's a real winner, is Ares. Ares is arrogant, he is violent, but he is also whiny and childlike and, not actually as tough as he thinks he is. And Ares is the one that really kind of takes the mask off. So we meet him when, the kids are traveling across the United States on a quest, and he stops in Colorado, and they stop in a diner, and he basically threatens a waitress. And when the kids kind of push back on this, he goes, "Are you kidding? I love this country. Best place in Sparta." If a guy like Ares says that he loves the United States, then what does that say about the United States? Well, that it's a country literally based on violence and founded on violence. But not on the heroic violence that is sometimes also glorified in these books, but on the unequal violence of the bully against the victim, the oppressor against the oppressed. And then when the oppressed fight back, these same people will turn around and turn tail and play the victim. on a more kind of general scale, the gods are collectively portrayed as neglectful and absent parents. So the way things work in the book is these gods, they parent these children. Some of them take an active view in their lives at some point. Some of them don't. They don't even bother kind of claiming their kids, even though demigods are in danger from monster attacks. And when those that do take an active interest in their children's lives usually do so to, send their kids on quests or to use their children to fight battles that they can't fight directly. And Percy, Riordan doesn't have really pleasant things to say about modern parenting in real life. He actually has Percy literally compare the kids he meets at Camp Half-Blood to the kids that he knows at Yancey Academy, the troubled school that he used to go to. It says, that the kids at Camp Half-Blood remind him a lot of the children of rich kids that he knew who would just kind of get dumped at this boarding school for troubled kids and ignored by their parents. But it's not just, I think, an indictment of poor parenting. It's also an indictment in general of the Western view of people, where it's a very utilitarian view, where if you can't be of use, if you're not productive, then you don't matter and you're not important, even for kids. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that Riordan had this in mind, at least kind of in the back of his mind when writing this, because he is writing this with his own child in mind who has several learning differences. And as I said, his targeting audience were kids with learning differences and disabilities who were kind of told that they don't matter, that they're not intelligent just because they have dyslexia or ADHD or another disability. So it's clear that Riordan is kind of critiquing this idea. And what's also interesting is that kind of Percy's discovery of the flaws of the gods happens on a road trip across America. So he gets sent on this quest with his friends Annabeth and Grover to go from New York to Los Angeles to try and get back Zeus's lightning bolt. And as he's traveling across America, he's also learning more and more about this world that he didn't know about, and discovering that actually it's not that great. And I just thought it was an interesting parallel to kind of as you learn more and more about the United States and how it was literally founded on land theft and on genocide of Native Americans, on massive enslavement of Black people, you also become disillusioned with the country in the same way that Percy becomes disillusioned with the gods. And I really like this because I think before I read Percy Jackson, obviously I'm not saying Rick Riordan invented the fact that Western civilization is bad and that Greeks were not great, but the media that I was exposed to as a fourth grader in post-Bush America, or Bush America, post 9/11 America, was mostly about how the West is great, and by contrast, a lot of the media about ancient Greece, or the curriculum about ancient Greece, focused on really lionizing these city-states, these civilizations. Which, it begs the question, okay, if we inherited all these wonderful things from ancient Greece, like, democracy and columns and geometry, then don't the negative aspects of Western civilization also have their roots in ancient Greece? Now, I want to do a slight digression because I recently read a book that I love so much, and it also kind of examines this kind of negative aspect of ancient Greece, and it ties really well with Percy Jackson, even though they're completely different genres. So, slight digression. I wanted to talk about this book that I really love. It's called Brod za Issu in Croatian. And it was translated in English as The Cat at the End of the World, which I'm not too enamored of that translation, but I'm not going to touch that. So this book, it follows a young enslaved boy named Gallia, who was born into slavery on the Greek colony of the island of Syracuse. And the house that he is a slave in, the master buys a cat and he named Mew, and he gifts the cat to his own spoiled son, who abuses the cat because the cat likes Gallia better. And Gallia is so moved by the plight of this cat that he steals her, runs away, and also eventually takes this donkey Mikro and joins an expedition to Issu, which is a new colony that the Greeks are establishing. And Issu is on an island in modern-day Croatia. So on this journey, since Gallia is able to pose as a freeborn boy, he becomes a free member of Greek society. But because he grew up enslaved, he can never pass over the very unequal aspects of Greek society that, other people are just able to stomach because they've never even thought about others around them. And what's especially interesting is Gallia is never able to just accept the very callous way that the Greek people that he lives with treat nature and especially animals. So there's a very moving scene where, the donkey Mikro that he brings with him is then put to work constructing the colony, and he is overworked, he is beaten, he's treated very poorly, and Gallia is very bothered by this, and he wants to save him. And everyone else in the colony kind of thinks that he's crazy for caring this much about a donkey. And I'm not going to read out the quote because it's in Croatian, so I'll just loosely translate it. There's a scene where he says, I came to Issu to free myself, but then I made Mikro a slave. And the book, which the author Robert Perišić describes as an eco-historical novel, it's on the surface, it's about this kind of this Greek colony and the very callous way that society is built in it, and the very hierarchical way that Greek society is, which also not just, placing men above women, citizens above slaves, but it also places humans above animals, and then the civilized world above nature. And Perišić is using kind of this ancient Greek world to also criticize the way that modern Western civilization treats the natural world callously, and the way we see ourselves as removed from animals, from plants, from nature. And it's a really beautiful book. I can't vouch for the translation, but I really recommend reading it, especially for this very kind of critical look at ancient Greece. And what's interesting is that this idea that kind of the separation of man from nature as a separate entity from nature is not just Perišić. A lot of scholars have traced that back to ancient Greece. And there's a scene in Percy Jackson that actually traces that to ancient Greece. So Grover, who's a satyr, at one point is telling Percy about this quest to find the god Pan, and the hopes that this will save the degradation of nature, and how Pan is the god of wild things. So he says, "The god of wild places disappeared 2,000 years ago. A sailor off the coast of Ephesus heard a mysterious voice crying out from the shore. Tell them that the great god Pan has died. When humans heard the news, they believed it. They've been pillaging Pan's kingdom ever since." So, again, one of the great evils of Western civilization, pollution and natural degradation, is traced back to ancient Greece, in literature, but also in some philosophies. Man, I just hope Robert Perišić doesn't get, offended that I talked about his book while talking about the work of children's literature, because it's very much not children's literature. But anyway, so if the Greek gods are flawed, if Western civilization, as it's portrayed in the books and as we live it, is flawed, then is Percy Jackson one of those series when the villains are right? So, Just a quick explainer. So the main villain of this book, and here is where the spoilers come in, is Luke, who starts out as Percy and Annabeth's friend and head counselor of the Hermes cabin, who turns to Kronos, the Titan who wants to overthrow the gods, and betrays Percy. And Luke has this really interesting villain monologue in the forest where he cites a whole bunch of motivations, such as, his father's disregard of him, and how the gods just abandon their children, and how the world is kind of really unfair to demigods is the reason why he's joining Kronos. And, he's not wrong. And you'll get a lot of this conversation in fan spaces. Like I heard this on the podcast Seaweed Brain where they were saying, well, maybe, he has a point. So is Luke right? Not really. Actually, not at all. Because Luke's problem with Western civilization is not that it's unequal, that he's not on top. He tells Percy that, he has this weapon made that can kill monsters, but also humans. In the world of the books, it's a big taboo for demigods to fight humans, because since demigods have godly powers, they're inherently unequal, so, they're not allowed to fight an enemy who is, inherently less powerful than them, but Luke disregards that, and he talks about how he's going to drive humans back to their caves, and their demigods will rule. Which, doesn't sound like you're doing much to dismantle the unequal distribution of power there. But the real big sign that Luke is not at all right, and he's a villain, is that right before he starts his villain monologue, he crumples up a soda can and throws it into this stream. And pollution is a big no-no in Camp Half-Blood. And it's the real sign that, okay, something's wrong here. And it's also the sign that for all of his, big talk, not actually right. Because if one of the big flaws, as we established, of Western civilization is its disregard of the environment, then the person who is polluting the environment is just contributing to the worst of Western civilization. So then if Luke's not right, and the gods are real messed up, what is the way forward? And as Percy Jackson shows, the way to dismantle an unequal civilization like the one in this book, or Western civilization, is care. And we see this on their journey through the underworld. So on the journey to the underworld, first, they're not allowed in at first because living beings can't enter the underworld. But the way they get in is, with some bribery, but also because Percy listens to Chiron, the ferryman, complain about his poor work conditions. And then they get past Cerberus, the guard dog, because he's lonely and they play with him. And even when Percy has his audience with Hades and Hades attacks him and he has a split second to get to safety and also choose between rescuing his friends or rescuing his mom, he uses those seconds to kind of tell Hades about the problems he discovered in the underworld and get him to help the people and the monsters that he met. And he actually explicitly says this. Hold on. So while they're talking about it, Percy says, even here in the underworld, everybody, even monsters, needed a little attention once in a while. Percy, obviously he's a scary fighter and a good fighter, but he doesn't overcome his obstacles just by fighting. He overcomes it because he cares about others. Not just those who are stronger than him or his equals, or those he's interested in, or those who are in a position to help him, but those that he's been told that are his enemies, like monsters. And what this book really shows us is that care on an individual level starts to kind of build up those relationships that are undermined by the pressures of Western civilization, by the hierarchical nature. And in the rest of the series, we start to see how institutional models of care are the way to dismantle the inequalities inherent in Western civilization. We don't get ahead by just fighting. Percy doesn't get ahead just by fighting. He gets ahead by caring. I mean, obviously this isn't like a super radical philosophy. It's something that is pretty common in children's books, but I thought it was interesting kind of in this context of a typical fantasy novel of, you know, chosen ones and fighting. And obviously, more radical philosophers and more coherent video essayists than myself have talked about it. And there are more radical versions of this philosophy than Percy Jackson. But I found it interesting that when revisiting this book, that's what I found. The importance of care. And that brings us to the last question. Does it hold up? And my verdict is yes, it absolutely holds up, because rereading it as an adult, not only was the humor amazing, not only was the plot fast-paced, and it kept me on the edge of my seat, even though I obviously knew what happened because I've read this maybe 10 times since I was a kid. And I found a message that I think kind of flew over my head when I was a kid, just looking to see who would win the battle. And that's a true sign that a book holds up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in a few weeks.